This is a production of Cornell University.
Hello and welcome to the first iteration of Books Sandwiched In for the semester. So Books Sandwiched In is our event where you guys have a chance to meet and chat with. Of course, that involves a certain amount of courage and coming up to us, your professors in the English department, and also to hear from your professors about their interests. I want to say that something about the title, Books Sandwiched In, the verb sandwiched, we couldn't do it as, I feel like we wanted to say the word book and the word sandwich together. But to use the verb sandwiched is, I think, to suggest that the books are being sort of worked in, almost as if they're afterthoughts. We're trying to get the books in. But of course, the lovely thing about being an English major is that the books are not afterthoughts. The books are your job. Your job and my job right now, and my job for the rest of my life, is mostly going to be to read and think about books and to find complicated, interesting, and personal things to say about them. So we get to listen to Jenny Mann talk about that a little bit today, but we also get to talk with one another about books that are important to us. So over here, for instance, there's a small discussion of 9/11 literature based on, I forgot your name. Jessica is writing a thesis on that. So those opportunities to talk amongst ourselves about the books that make us happy is very much what this major, but also this event, is about. So without further ado, and I apologize that I'm going to use my iPhone for this, this is Professor Jenny Mann, who has been my colleague here now for 9 years. Are you starting your 10th? Starting your 9th. Oh, my Lord. She teaches courses like Utopia from Thomas More to Science Fiction, Literature and the Scientific Revolution, Shakespeare and Film, English Renaissance Drama, and the ever-popular, although badly titled, The English Literary Tradition 1. A class I personally love to teach. But
and nobody likes it, but I love it.
I just feel like I love it, but the title is just so off-putting somehow, and yet it promises exactly what it delivers. What are you going to do? She also has a book that I very much recommend, Outlaw Rhetoric, Figuring Vernacular Eloquence in Shakespeare's England. So that is just the basic outline of what you need to know about Jenny Mann, but she will tell us more.
Hey, Masha, could I just also
yes.
ask
Mr. Roger Gilbert.
Yeah, I was going to say that there are a bunch of faculty here. And
I should
usually,
introduce.
Well, or we can just introduce ourselves. I'm Roger Gilbert. I'm the chair of the English department, and I mostly teach courses in American poetry. And
I'm Jeremy Grodek, and I teach 20th century American literature and culture.
I'm Greg Lomdi. I teach 20th century, 21st century poetry.
I'm Alicia Cohn. I teach 19th century British literature.
And I guess I should say I'm Masha Raskolnikov. This semester I'm teaching a class on the body, but most of the time I teach classes like Chaucer or the English Literary Tradition 1 or Medieval or Renaissance Drama. So you can come to me and some of the rest of us for the pre-1800s requirements that I will also remind you about as the Director of Undergraduate Studies.
Masha, just mention that you're the DOS now.
Yeah, I'm the DOS. I'm the person who signs the forms. Oh, and Phil!
Hi, I'm Philip Lorenz. I teach courses on Renaissance Drama and the Intro to Literary Theory course, and I'm directing honors.
anybody we missed?
Anyone else hiding the forms?
Should I go?
Go.
Okay, hi. I know some of you, but not all of you. But it's a pleasure to have the chance to talk to you a little bit about myself and my research and my teaching. It's going to be pretty informal, though I did make notes to remember some of the things I wanted to talk about. I thought I'd start just by giving you a kind of intellectual biography and a story about how I ended up here as an English professor, just to give you a sense of where I come from. I'm from a really small town in the Midwest called Macomb, Illinois. Both my parents were English professors at a place called Western Illinois University. And so, unlike, I assume, many or all of you, I was aware from a very early age that this was a career option that was possible. Books were a huge part of my life, as I'm sure they're a huge part of your life. I was reading all the time, and in junior high and high school, it was probably the most important thing I had going on. So the stuff I was reading, I was really into like 19th century Victorian, like mammoth novels. That's what I want. Yes, that's what I wanted to read all the time, and a lot of fantasy novels. That was my thing in high school, and that's where my passion and excitement really was. And I had some friends who also loved reading, but most of the people I went to school with weren't so interested in it necessarily. They had other kinds of more social interests, but that was my thing. And when I went to university, I went to Yale. I immediately declared a major in English. It was very unimaginative of me. I only wanted to take literature classes, and my great regret is that I wasn't a little bit more adventurous in the kinds of courses that I took. Not only did I only want to take English classes, I really only wanted to take British literature written before the 20th century. So I have huge gaps to this day in my understanding of what's out there, particularly in the 20th century and beyond. So another thing I would change if I could go back is just to try more things, try to take classes that were in topics and areas that I didn't already have an investment in. But I just really wanted to read a lot of like Dickens and George Eliot and Shakespeare. So that's what I did, and I loved it. And then I went to graduate school at Northwestern, and I declared my interest in being an early modernist entirely because I loved Shakespeare. I knew absolutely nothing else about that period. I consider myself quite lucky that I got into graduate school, given how ignorant I was of many facets of what it means to declare yourself as a researcher in a particular field of knowledge. And but I luckily was well trained, and by the end of graduate school I had an understanding that I was a Renaissance or early modernist, which are the period terms we use to designate 16th and 17th century English literature, Shakespeare being the most famous writer of that era, but certainly many other well-known poets and playwrights and prose writers, Philip Sidney, John Donne, George Herbert, Christopher Marlowe, Francis Bacon, so on and so forth. And so that was my interest, and I ended up getting a postdoctoral fellowship here at Cornell, and then subsequently being hired and joining the faculty. So that's the kind of very quick and fast story of me. I think what always was my interest, even as an undergrad and certainly as a scholar and teacher, was just trying to figure out, like, what is the force of a literary text? Like, what kind of thing is it? What kind of effects does it have in the world? Why do they matter so much to some people, to many people? Why do they matter more and sometimes than others? Sort of what is the thing that is imaginative literature, and why is it different from other kinds of things, and particularly from other kinds of writing? So that was a question that I always had. And so while I was in graduate school, I wrote a dissertation that ended up becoming the draft of my first book. What you do usually in the first 6 years of a career, should you get a tenure-track job in an American college or university, is you write a monograph or a book that's a significant piece of research in your specialized field. And if you complete that book and publish it, you have a good shot of getting tenure at your institution. So that's the kind of the focus of the younger junior faculty in the departments in which you take classes. So that was my focus when I arrived here. And I was working on a book called Outlaw Rhetoric, which is a title I think is so awesome and that I did not come up with. My dissertation advisor helped me come up with it. I'm really bad at titles, but when you have a great title, it's so wonderful, and so just you feel so proud. It's like, I made this thing and it has this great title, and I think it's great. It's like, because it's about Robin Hood. I'm really into Robin Hood, like, and in terms of entertainment, but also intellectually. So anyway, I love my title of my book, and I'm always proud to say it. In any case, the book was, in the broadest possible sense, attempting to answer the question, how did imaginative writing or literary production happen in this period? We get this absolute explosion of literary productivity in the second half of the 16th century, actually astonishing flowering of literary writing. And I wanted to know, like, how and why that happened in that time and in that place. Like, where did these stories come from? And I was writing about Shakespeare's plays and poetry, but I was also working on Edmund Spenser's Faerie Queene, which is a text some of you may know. And Ben Jonson play, and also this really weird utopia that I've made some of you read excerpts from, Margaret Cavendish's Blazing World. So where did these stories come from? What I determined over the course of my research is that schoolroom training in the art of rhetoric seemed to be key to this process of literary invention. So I began to learn everything I could about those methods of education in the 16th and 17th century. Like at the most basic level, how were the literate trained to read and write? What techniques and procedures were taught in the schools? The art of rhetoric, I should say, for this culture was understood as the science of speaking well. Right? That would be the definition of the art of rhetoric. And what this led me into thinking about is all of the various disciplines of knowledge as they were constituted in this period and their relationship to one another. So I was like, so what is the relationship between rhetoric and poetry, or the relationship between what we would call the arts of language and other kinds of arts such as mathematics or natural philosophy? So what overlaps do they share and what distinguishes them? During Shakespeare's lifetime, so in the end of the 16th century, rhetoric was essentially the queen of the arts and sciences. It was the preeminent subject at the grammar school level, and it was the discipline through which you would enter into advanced learning, even at the university level. It was thought of as a kind of toolkit discipline, a logic being the other toolkit discipline. So it was the kind of training that would allow you to do other kinds of things as a student and a scholar. And yet, it was sort of firmly established at the pinnacle of this educational system. Completely pervasive, and yet less than 1 century after Shakespeare's death, rhetoric had been greatly discredited as a source of knowledge and understanding, and it was said to deal with empty words rather than real and substantive things. So a precipitous fall from prestige and institutional authority that happened shockingly quickly. Shocking because rhetoric had been so prominent an educational method in Western Europe for basically 2 millennia, right? So it had been around a long time and was very firmly established in this culture, and yet all of a sudden, within a relatively short period of time, you have lots of different kinds of people saying it's empty, right? And it has no meaning, and it shouldn't be the way people are taught. And I thought that was really fascinating. This is probably familiar to you. I think the connotation of the word rhetoric now is sort of, you think mere rhetoric, empty words, something that isn't substantial, doesn't have any necessary relationship to truth, and in fact might even work in opposition to truth. So there's a connotation that rhetoric is a kind of lying or manipulation. So this charge of emptiness is I came to understand, particularly ironic because throughout rhetoric's long history, its practitioners regularly claimed that words have mass, they have motion, they have measure, right? They have physical properties that endow them with the force to affect the people around them, and in fact to affect even the natural world and the cosmos. Words can make physical impressions. In a way, one of the things I came to understand by reading primary texts, but also reading the secondary work of scholars who have also been interested in this topic, the new experimental science that starts to establish itself at the end of the 17th century does so by wresting power away from rhetoric and claiming it on its own behalf. And you can best see this in looking what happens to a concept of matter over the course of the 16th and 17th century. So say sometime in the late 16th century, for someone who had been trained in the art of rhetoric, they would think of race, or the Latin word for things, as a term for the subject matter of rhetoric, right? The things or the subjects that make up your speech, right? And all of a sudden, by the end of the 17th century, you have English natural philosophers who are saying, no, the things are in the world. Like this chair is a thing. That's what the real thing is. And that's what a genuinely progressive and productive art of knowledge will be interested in getting after. Words are a mere distraction. There's no thing there. They get in the way of things. And so that shift kind of gives you a sense of the epistemological aggression, is how I put it. The epistemological aggression that early scientists had in making this move against the arts of language and claiming on their own behalf things that used to fall under the domain of rhetoric. So I, in this book, got interested in how this happened, right? How did early new science discredit the art of rhetoric, and what was the means by which it did so. So this is all to say, in the course of working on this project, I began to find this competition among different disciplines of knowledge as really dramatic and exciting. I don't know if it strikes you as such, but I think it's a kind of fascinating, intellectually, historically, culturally, to see how these battles are fought among teachers, but also writers and thinkers in these various moments in history as they try and talk about what they're doing when they write something and why it should matter and what their source of authority is. So I became really interested in that. And this has played into a lot of my teaching here at Cornell, as well as my current research. So I finished the rhetoric book, and since then have been working on a new research project that is ongoing, that is called, or this isn't as good a title, but I think it's pretty good. It's called Orpheus on Trial, Renaissance Poetics and the History of Knowledge. And this is investigating how early modern writers tried to define fiction, what it is, what it does, the effect it has in the world, how it might be different from other kinds of writing, other kinds of arts, what its particular knowledge is and its particular social effects. This is hence the literature and science that's in the title of my talk today. This is really what I'm interested in. A lot of current research on not just early modern studies, but in all different historical periods, has become really invested in revealing or shining a light on the overlap between literature and science, certainly in the pre-modern world, but also well beyond that, as the teaching of many English department faculty has made clear. So according to this research, what you might read someone arguing that composing a poem, producing a play, and conducting an experiment might be understood as all the same sort of thing, right? They are parallel endeavors that aim to invent something, right? And so the invention that is the poem, or the invention that is the result of the experiment that leads to a hypothesis, like what would happen if you thought of those as similar kinds of things? What changes, rather than putting them on across some kind of divide and distinguishing them from one another. This research has been hugely persuasive, and lots of people from undergrads all up are doing work in this particular area, and I've designed all kinds of courses that build on this idea. And in fact, it's been so persuasive that now, after having spent years living with these arguments, I find myself now perversely wanting to resist them a little bit. And so even more recently, I've become interested in all of the ways fiction or invented imaginative literature isn't like anything else, right? And that people who are making things up actually understand themselves to be doing something that's totally different from the kinds of things a philosopher might see himself or herself as doing. And so that's where I am right now. And you never know when you're doing research how you end up in these arguments, and there is always this sort of perversity of not wanting to go along with the flow, but that's where I am right now. But nonetheless, a lot of my favorite classes to teach here at Cornell really do focus on these points of productive overlap. Most obviously, I teach a course on literature and the scientific revolution, where every week we read texts that might be variously classified as either literary or scientific, an attempt to think about how they share the same procedures. So a week on anatomy might think about anatomical manuals and medical texts side by side with poems that talk about anatomizing the body. And so in my coursework, I still like to do a lot of this kind of work. And I also teach a class on a survey of utopia, from Thomas More to science fiction. And in the science fiction part of the course in particular, it's always really fun to think about that genre label and why it has that kind of energy, or that it seems so oxymoronic, and that's part of the excitement of labeling a text that way. But like, why should it be so that those things would feel so odd to be yoked together? But still, at basis, I think the classes are still trying to get at the same big questions, and that is like, what is fiction or a literary invention? Like, how does it work? What does it do in the world? And also really to render uncomfortable the distinction between the real and the not real. And that's, if I have a kind of agenda as a teacher, I think that that's my biggest agenda, is to not cede reality to everything that happens outside of what we read in our classroom. I don't think we need to give that away just because the things that we're studying are fictional, right? I don't think that at all means that they're not real. It seems to be a very handy way of devaluing the humanities in general, but certainly the work that we as students of literature are doing. So that's my agenda, such as I have it. So those are really my remarks. It was really quite broad, but thank you for letting me share my research. And now I guess we could talk, or if you have questions, I'm happy to talk more about classes or texts.
Can I ask something?
Sure.
Yes, science and literature seems to be exploding in all kinds of ways. Mm-hmm. Here in this department, lots of people are interested in it, but then more broadly, there's sort of what I think of as another version of this convergence, which takes the form of interest in things like cognitive science, sure, digital humanities, sure, and so on. And I'm wondering about the sort of the role of authority in these different kinds, models of, bringing together science and literature, because it seems to me that what you're interested in is a model in which literature retains its authority, sure, and indeed may in some cases, that authority may trump the authority of scientific texts, mm-hmm, whereas a lot of people now seem to be wanting to invoke the authority of science to somehow provide insight into literature that is thought not to be available within that realm. Yeah. So, I mean, is that a strong distinction in your view, or is there some?
Yeah, no, I think that's an accurate reading of the situation. I think there is a kind of a cynical way of interpreting this flurry of research into literature, or science and humanities, or science and literature studies, and that is that on university campuses, and certainly in the wider world, science has incredible amounts of prestige, incredible amounts of money, and even at the level of us trying to interest our students, like many of you, I won't name you, but many undergraduates come to university with an understanding of certain majors as practical and certain majors as impractical or somehow self-indulgent. Practicality, actually, that science should be practical, is a notion invented by one Francis Bacon, someone we'll be talking about later today. So that's a Renaissance notion in and of itself. But in any case, and so one could say that scholars in English departments or literature departments are rightly diagnosing that there's this cultural value attached to science, and somehow trying to attach what we do to that larger discourse as a way of staying relevant and keeping an audience for our research, getting funding, getting students. And there is a certain part of that going on. With that said, I think as anyone who's done any serious reading of the kind of work that's being produced by people who want to think about this overlap, it's actually extremely deep and often quite fascinating. The largest way in which it's changed from a kind of older generation of scholars who might think about the science and literature relationship, they might think, oh, okay, so you have poems that are about the cosmos, or that are about the movement of fluids throughout the human body, right? So the topics that literature takes on might be identified as scientific, or you might have a scientist, which is a very modern term, but I'll use for ease, who, say, writes a theory of how the planets move in verse, right? So you have a scientist who uses literary form in some way to transmit scientific information. So those would be kind of two ways of thinking about the relationship between literature and science. And what scholars have been doing more recently as a way of building on that older work is to think about not just topical overlap, but actually how the productions of literature and science are functioning in the same way, and aim at the same procedures. So you might think of, for example, hypothesis as a fictional world making, like the fictional world making that happens in a novel, for example. And so, to me, that's what's really exciting. Is it's thinking about the making of the thing that doesn't cede. You're right. It doesn't cede anything to science as having greater authority or greater access to truth or greater significance. It says, in fact, these two acts, human acts, the making of an experiment and the making of a poem, are operating in ways that are quite similar, though they seem to occupy totally different realms. And I think that's really interesting and exciting. And I know a lot of you find that even in your daily life. Many of you are double bio English majors or psychology English. You're doing lab, even if you're not double majoring, you're taking labs, you're doing things, and I'm sure you're seeing like points of consilience and overlap in the work that you're doing as students, even in these very different environments. And so the research is sort of trying to uncover that in ways that's really interesting. But yeah, I don't like ceding anything away from the literary. It's always hard for me to imagine anything that could have more power than the stories we tell each other every day. That again, I was raised to think that, so it's not a surprise, but that's where my angle is.
So I'm a double linguistics major in addition to English, and linguistics is kind of like, the way it thinks about itself is kind of bizarre in a way, because like it tries to think of itself as like a science, but it also is like seemingly perpetually unsure about whether it wants to describe what's going on in the brain to create language, or whether it wants to just like be this cool logic thing that sounds like that, creates the form of language, and like creating just like complicated logic that could approximate language. So it seems like it could almost be like three things, like literary in the sense of texts that are very, very human, take humanness for granted. Yeah. Like science that tries to think of exactly how things work, try to describe a thing and not sorry, I'm not being very articulate.
No. I get what you mean.
Yeah, and then there's like this logic where it's like, oh, this is like really cool, like we're creating the system that describes this thing, and there's sort of this tension. Are we trying to describe what's going on in the brain, or are we just sort of doing this, just creating a really cool model? And do you think
That's a question.
that third do you think that third category is like a real category and that it's related to these other two?
Yeah, I do actually. I mean, I don't happen to think about that very much myself, but I think that there are lots of literary scholars who do. I wanted to ask you, do you find it energizing, this collision of different procedures and priorities in your major? Because that sounds kind of exciting.
It is kind of energizing. It's also frustrating.
Yeah.
Because people like try to put precedence on one over the other
Sure.
as a way to sort of
Got it.
not think about the other.
Yeah. So one way of thinking about it is, and these are the kind of questions you end up finding yourself asking often if you do any work in the history of science, history and sociology of science, because these are the kinds of questions historians and sociologists of science ask themselves all the time. But that is sort of like, what are your procedures for producing knowledge? Like what counts as evidence? What would count as a demonstration? What authority gets to decide what's true or proven or factual? And there are different ideas of the ultimate authority there and what you've mapped out, right? Something that would be more textual and have to do with textual analysis, or something that would be an almost like perfect science of the brain, right? That would be this is a fantasy, not a fantasy, I shouldn't be dismissive, but this is like an idea that's taken really powerful hold right now, I think, not just in the academy, but in our culture, that if you can kind of like figure out what those neurons are doing, if we really understand the brain and how it works, it's going to provide answers to all different kinds of questions. So any serious person wants to get after that, and everything else is just sort of epiphenomenon of what's really happening in the brain. And there are actually a lot of literary scholars doing work in cognitive science who would be really totally in tune with that. But there, as you mentioned, are other kinds of evidence and other standards of authority. And I think one thing that tends to distinguish our field is you end up just coming back to the text over and over again as the place where you generate your arguments, but also the place where you go to test whether they're working, right? And the text kind of retains that authority almost more so, I think. I mean, I'm embarrassed to say this in front of my colleagues because I'm just talking right now. I haven't thought this through, but I think the text trumps any system in the end for most scholars of literature, or that's where you'd find the most consensus, whereas it doesn't sound like that would necessarily be the case in a linguistics department, which sounds fascinating, actually. Yeah.
I wonder, can you think of science when you take a variable and kind of isolate it? And I know very little about science, so this is just, like layman's terms.
Yeah.
Is it almost like, say, an author writing a dystopian novel and you're testing a variable and you're doing it's almost a fiction in itself if you're isolating it from reality?
Absolutely. One of my favorite writers, Ursula Le Guin, who I impress on all of you to go read for greater happiness and erudition, said that sci-fi is a thought experiment, right? It's a way of producing a kind of knowledge in a controlled circumstance. So I think that comparison is totally apt and absolutely in line with the kind of thinking that's happening right now of how you would compare these two kinds of activities.
I'm going to have to tell my engineering roommate that.
Yeah, exactly. I think, what I found is that, everyone traffics in cliches when they're talking about what other people do. Like what the engineers are doing is blah, 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 and it's always cliched and unfair. But one thing that you always learn when you have students in the classroom who aren't humanities majors is how well aware they are of the contingency of the work that they're doing, the level of imagination it requires, the extent to which language shapes their ideas and their arguments, and so it's never quite the caricature you imagine. Though I still think we have plenty to say to them about research and knowledge. But I think that's a really smart observation.
I remember you were a few years ago interviewing the great Margaret Atwood, perhaps in that very chair.
Yeah.
And I was thinking, about what seems to me to be the sort of increased literary clout of science fiction in general. I mean, the reputations like Philip Dick and William Gibson are being, they're being recognized.
He's
as
being
really
included in the Library of America.
Yeah, right.
Really
major
different.
writers. So I would just love to hear you talk more about science fiction from the last 50 or 60 years. But I also want to ask if there, how far back would you go? Is Utopia a science fiction text?
Oh, this is an interesting question. I'm sure period bias. I tend to be really tribal. I don't know if that's come through about field, and then within my field about my period. I would say science fiction is an epiphenomenon of utopia myself, although there are plenty who argue the reverse, and some really interesting work on that very topic. I mean, the conventional history of science fiction sources it to kind of 20th century kind of pulp publications, and also these periodicals that started appearing that would publish like the amazing stories, and a lot of early Philip K. Dick, and that is one way of talking about the origin of science fiction, though certainly you could plausibly identify something like Margaret Cavendish's Blazing World is just from 1666. Is super sci-fi. People like travel to another planet, and there's beast men and bird men and crazy, and then people become invisible spirits and go inside brains. I mean, it's really a lot of the nutty stuff that we still associate with science fiction. I don't think that phrase as a label for a genre could only come into being in a world that's already convinced that science and fiction are two totally different things. And that world was not the world of the 16th century. So there is, if you want to call it label the genre in that way, it is something that could only emerge after this kind of full separation of the disciplines that I'm talking about had happened at some point in the modern era. But the genre of utopia had a historically pretty high stature in comparison to this like kind of emergent genre of sci-fi with stuff like H.G. Wells and then Philip K. Dick in the 20th century. And I think it's super fascinating how much that has changed even in the last decade. The spike in prestige and interest that probably has a lot to do with our own world's increasing investment in the power and prestige of technology in general as the great engine of not just our economy, but our politics and how we think about who we are and what we do. But I think also just people read it. It's a thing people still do read in the way that they don't necessarily read novels as much as they used to. But sci-fi, I mean, that's why I love to teach it, is that I find that Cornell undergrads, even those who are not majoring in English or even the humanities, often are reading that and are interested in talking about that. So it's a kind of gateway drug to reading other kinds of things. So that's why I really love teaching it. I mean, the change in Philip K. Dick's stature is really fascinating because in many ways he's a super bad writer, like really bad writer, but like amazingly inventive. In the world making, which kind of counts for a lot. But I think it's only gonna change. And now even fantasy is coming in to being legitimized as like not a shameful thing. I mean, I never would have read a fantasy book in public when I was a teenager. They had like super embarrassing covers, and girls didn't, I mean, girls were reading it, but it was kind of thought of as an adolescent boy thing, and it just would have been it wouldn't have been cool. And now it's just really become more mainstream. I mean, I'm not enough. I'd be embarrassed to stake an argument. Again, I'm not a 20th centuryist, except only as I dabble to teach these classes, so I wouldn't want to make some kind of overarching argument. It's possible that serial television has something to do with people's investment in long-form, sprawling romance narratives that fantasy narratives tend to kind of be, but that was a kind of sprawling answer. Yeah.
Okay. You mentioned serial television. This might be kind of an unfair question because you've come here to talk about literature and science, and now I'm going to ask you about TV.
Yeah.
I know you've got it in you.
Yeah.
So your work, on the one hand, traces continuities and through lines from the Renaissance to the modern and even most postmodern period in relation to invention and science and literature. But what impression do you have of the popularity of shows that are ostensibly about the Renaissance, like Game of Thrones?
Many thoughts about Game of Thrones.
Is that a genuine historical interest that our current culture has, or is our current culture really interested in itself in Renaissance hairstyles?
That is fascinating. I posit, this could be wishful thinking, but I think Game of Thrones is popular because the early modern period is the most interesting period. I 100% believe that. Do you watch that? Do you read that? How many of you? So plurality, I don't know what that word means. So some of you, many of you. Like these books, I mean, it's like a kind of through the looking glass version of the War of the Roses. Sort of obliquely retold in this world that feels medieval, but there are kind of elements of magic and the fantastic hovering around the margins. So not every character within the fiction knows that magic is real. You, the reader, know that magic is real, and there are dragons that are shaping the effects of this world, but in the kind of like scene by scene basis, most of what happens is quite prosaic and bloody. And but I think the reason the books and the show is really attuned to this are a kind of fictionalized version of what's so fascinating about the early modern period, and that is a point of transition between a feudal world and a kind of modern world of capitalism, in which old structures of authority are crumbling and new ones are coming in to replace them. And the people who get that thrive, and the people who don't die, like horribly, right? The people who are still adhering to an older code, like meet horrible dooms, and you guys all know what I'm thinking of, the ones who watch it. But the people who are onto it make something violent often and chilling, but exciting and new. And that's the energy of the early modern period. Like that's Hamlet's predicament, right? Like he had a dad who was like a proper feudal king, but that's not the world anymore. But he doesn't know how to live in this new world because he doesn't totally get it. And it's exciting, and the literature that's produced in that moment is exciting. And I think that's the drama of Game of Thrones. And also the dragons are amazing, and there's this sort of like super intense, violent, great powers thing happening. But that's the Renaissance too. I mean, so that actually, I think that all of the globe is fascinated by early modernity, but they just don't know it because they haven't been given that context. But I think that's why Game of Thrones is so amazing. And there's this amazing speech. Do you remember that speech Littlefinger gives where he says chaos is a ladder? Do you remember that? That is early modernity. I cried. I actually cried. I was with my husband and I was crying. I'm like, they're justifying my entire experience. Where they're like, the world is gonna fall into chaos, doom, doom. And he's like this Machiavellian, horrible person. He said chaos is a ladder. And that is Renaissance drama to me, is like the people who figure out the chaos is a ladder. And anyway, so that's my...
Yes. Jenny, I think we're kind of out of time,
okay.
But before we completely end and we applaud, could you recommend some books for us to read?
Oh, yes.
Because it sounds like you just recommended the Game of Thrones books / show.
Yeah, I read, this is just, just read this crazy book. It's part of a trilogy. I've only read one. The first one is called Annihilation, or Annihilation? By this guy, Jeff Vandermeer. It's going to be a trilogy, and it's, all I can tell you is there are 5 unnamed female protagonists. Like one is a biologist, one is a geographer, one is a linguist, one is a psychologist. I can't remember what the fifth, but they're only known by their profession and their role in the expedition, and they're sent to on this expedition into Area X, and they're the 12th such expedition. And all other previous expeditions have vanished, and they're the 12th expedition being sent to Area X. And their aims are murky, and what's happened and what's going to happen is murky. Anyway, it's like 180 pages, and I could not put it down. It was really quite gripping. So I recommend that. And then in a totally different genre, I'm a big mystery buff. Do you guys read mysteries? And I love this Irish writer named Tana French, who's incredible, and she has a new mystery out. She writes a mystery. Her mysteries, I think she's written 5, are about different members of a Dublin murder squad. The first one, Into the Woods, it's the best book you'll ever read. But her most recent one, The Secret Place, is set in a girls' boarding school in Dublin, and it's amazing. Oh, and Donna Tartt, read The Secret History. I know, I'll stop. That's what I read for fun.
Thank you so much.
Okay, bye.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.